On this Dakota Life Virtual, it's time to go fishing. And in particular, we're going to talk about fly fishing. Here's who we're going to talk to, and here's what we're going to talk about. It's Buddy Seiner. Buddy is here. He's an education specialist with Game Fish and Parks. And Buddy, you're also a fly fishing enthusiast, but this time of year, you want to connect that specifically with the white bass. However, I want to mention right up front that with people that we've talked to who are connecting virtually or working at home, oftentimes they have a number of interns that help them. And here are some of the interns that are helping Buddy. First off, we have Gray. And there's Maya. And we have Lily. Now, it's been a little time since we've shot these, but why don't you talk about your interns and how much fun you have fishing together?
Well, my interns are great participants, and they're great helpers in the fishing world, especially in the education world, because they are not shy about helping other people learn a new skill. And what's also great about them is, especially Maya, when she tries something one time, she thinks she's an expert at it. So she's more than happy to go and help someone learn how to cast or catch a white bass. But they are great helpers. They're great anglers. They love getting outside and just playing in the water, playing in the sand, touching fish. And hopefully they can inspire, a few other people to give it a try sometime.
Not only that, I mean, this may be a time when we're closer to our families because we can't get together in other gatherings with other people like we would want. But what do you tell people about that family fishing time that you have and what it means?
I think a lot of people take it for granted. Having family, and I know I do, especially, I'm educating people all the time about fishing. And a lot of times I find myself educating other family members and other families in general and their kids more than I'm educating my kids. And that's something I'm committing to this year, to be better at getting my kids out and teaching them how to fish, because I have taken it for granted in the past. And I would encourage people not to take it for granted. Get your kids out as much as you can fishing. Get other kids out as much as you can fishing if you can. And they will be better off for it, and you'll be better off for it.
Tell us real quickly some of the work that you do with Game Fish and Parks, specifically about fishing education and the resources that you help provide through GF&P.
So I'm specifically an aquatic education advisor, I guess you call me. I am fortunate to work with GFP to just help teach people about fishing, to help bring fishing into people's lives. That's one thing I'm really passionate about. And that website is gfp.sd.gov. And I'd encourage everyone to go there as a first stop for resources, for information, rules and regulations, especially about fish and fishing and outdoor opportunities in South Dakota.
Well, we're going to spend.
I'm really fortunate to work with GF&P. I get to help with all of their education events. We did trout in the classroom for a few years, and that was really exciting, helping kids learn about trout, raising them from eggs to fingerlings and then releasing them. I get to teach fishing classes and fishing events for schools and for family events. And it's just a really great opportunity for me, because education is such a big part of my fishing career, and bringing fishing, and especially fly fishing, into the lives of other people and helping them see what it brings into my life really is fulfilling and something I really appreciate. So I'm very appreciative of Game Fish and Parks for allowing me to do that and have this relationship with them.
Let's take a look at that slide again. This is the home page for fish identification, because we want to spend a few minutes talking specifically about an opportunity for this spring, this time of the spring, extra special, about fishing for the white bass. Tell us about the white bass, and then we'll go along and take a look at some of the techniques and tools you might want to have on hand to try it on a fly rod.
White bass are an amazing species, and most often you might hear walleye anglers grumbling about them when they happen to catch a white bass when they're trying to target walleyes. They'll say, "Oh, it's just another white bass." But I think more and more people are beginning to target them. They're a species that's found all around the state of South Dakota, most prominently in the Missouri River corridor and in the glacial lakes region. You'll find a lot of white bass. They are typically they're about 12 to 15 inches in length. They have 5 to 7 horizontal black stripes down their somewhat compressed body. They're white and silver in color, so a lot of times people call them silver bass. And they're a schooling fish, so you'll find them in large numbers more often than not. They are aggressive feeders. They feed on minnows, crustaceans, invertebrates, and they can get fairly large. A proud angler is 2 3/4 pounds, and they are just a hoot to catch. They pull really hard. They're good fighters, and they're really good to eat. If you cook them up next to walleye, a lot of people aren't going to be able to tell the difference. And that's a common misconception, I think, with white bass. A lot of people think they don't taste very good, but they are a little bit more difficult to clean than a walleye. Their bone structure is a little more rugged and sturdy, so they're a little bit harder to clean. But for fighting power and for availability and their willingness to eat a presentation, I think they're one of the top fish in South Dakota. And that's why I target them.
Well, and you've recommended, too, that it can be even more fun on a fly rod. Mention that as we start taking a look at some of the, in approaching with a fly rod, some of the lures and flies that you might recommend, particularly to target a white bass.
Fly fishing offers some advantages, mostly in presentation. Mark Sosin used to have a fishing show called Mark Sosin's Saltwater Journal. And one of his favorite phrases to use was, most of fishing is presentation. I was just out the other night fishing for white bass, and there were 4 anglers. There were 2 in a boat and 2 on shore that were pitching a jig and a minnow. And when you're casting, for example, a 3/8 ounce jig with a minnow, that's essentially your presentation. It's a minnow, it's a bait fish presentation, and you can only work a 3/8 ounce jig in a couple of different ways. So you're varied significantly in your presentation. What the fly offers is a number of different presentations in your back pocket. You can throw a bait fish pattern, you can throw a crustacean, you can throw an invertebrate, an insect pattern of some kind, and you can also vary the depth at which you're fishing so easily that you can quickly adjust to the white bass, because they are fairly finicky eaters as much as they do like to eat. Sometimes it's a very specific presentation that they will take. and sometimes that's, more often than not for me, it's a weightless presentation. So the fly is just maybe 2 or 3 inches under the water. So that right there is a belly ache minnow that, it's a bait fish presentation, but you can tie this pattern with weight or without weight. And so that rabbit fur on top just undulates in the water and drives those fish crazy. This is a larva-lace big-eyed deceiver, which is a variation of a very prominent lefties deceiver pattern, but it's smaller and it's a little more versatile with my fishing. And this is one of my go-tos. Along with this brown one here, this is a bully bugger with a big orange bead on the front. And I stole that orange bead from my daughters. They have necklace making kits, and that bead comes from those necklace making kits. But this is the fly that I was using 2 nights ago when I started catching white bass, and I was catching white bass in front of the jig anglers, because that fly just sits just below the surface, and that's what those fish were targeting. They were crashing little schools of bait fish. This is a Clouser minnow tied in blue and white. It's a great smelt imitation, so I've caught a lot of walleyes on that as well. But sometimes the color makes a huge difference. And there are days when I try to fish blue and they just won't eat a blue pattern, so I'll switch to chartreuse. And for some reason they'll see that chartreuse and it'll trigger a strike. But some days blue is the only thing that works. Later in the year now, when they are done spawning, they really school up and they'll start to feed aggressively. Topwater flies can work really well, and this is where the Gartside gurgler can be a really great pattern. It's a topwater fly that makes noise, has a lot of movement, and it's a really fun thing, especially on the Missouri River. When you're fishing in that really clear water, it's really fun to see 5 or 6 bass coming up and darting at your pattern before one is brave enough to come up and actually engulf it. And you can watch the whole thing happen. There are days when I just cannot catch them on anything. And then that's when I'll go to the fly on the screen now. It's called a hybrid carp fly. So in addition to chasing white bass, I love to chase common carp with a fly rod. This is all around greatest patterns around the world, I think, is this hybrid carp fly. And for some reason, I don't know exactly what they take it for, but white bass really love this pattern. I put it sometimes under a little strike indicator, which is a fancy term for bobber, and I will strip it along, and those white bass just love it. So this has become one of my go-tos for white bass when nothing else seems to work. This is called a Crelex, one of my favorite wintertime trout flies, has also become one of my favorite spring white bass flies, especially when you're fishing a little bit more stained or murky water. Here in Pierre, we have a place called Farm Island, and that water can often be stained, but it's usually warmer than everywhere else. So the white bass will begin to congregate there before they congregate anywhere else. And sometimes this fly can catch more fish than any others. This is another great deceiver pattern with I've added a little red marabou to the neck to emulate gills, and that seems to be a really good trigger when fishing. And the greatest thing about that pattern is it's virtually weightless, and when it sits in the water, it just basically hovers about 6 to 12 inches under the water's surface. So you can really present it any way you want. You want it to sink a little bit more, you can just add a little sink tip leader to your fly line. And again, that's a really quick change. Adds to the versatility of fly fishing. This is one of my favorite patterns for smallmouth bass, and it also works well for white bass. It's called a Murdich minnow. Most of these flies are available at fly shops. You know, there's Dakota Angler and Outfitter and Spearfish Creek Fly Shop out in the Black Hills. They will all have these patterns, and so you can definitely buy them online, or you can go to the store and buy them. But I tie all of my own flies. Sometimes I like to add a little bit of variety to them. Different materials and just a different tying style. And I've done that so that they meet my specific fishing needs, and that's mostly on the Missouri River. But everywhere you go, you're going to find different fishing circumstances. You're going to find different food sources. You're going to find different habitat. And so that will require you to vary your presentation a little bit. This is a thin mint. Again, one of the best white bass flies that I've found in recent years. It doesn't match the traditional white bass fly. A lot of people think white, flashy, colorful. The thin mint is kind of a drab. It's a darker color. It's just got an olive tail with some peacock dubbing and a grizzly hackle. And I apologize for the technical fly tying terms for anyone that is novice in that. But it's a fairly drab fly, but I think it emulates a minnow pattern or kind of a leech pattern really, really well. And that's what drives those white bass really wild. This is called a wiggle minnow. It's essentially a fly tying's version of a rapala. It floats, and when you strip it in, it just wobbles back and forth. It swims in the water really well. It's just a piece of foam with some turkey marabou tied on as a tail. And this is another great one for late May, June, and July, when those fish are super aggressive. They're schooled up, and they're looking for injured bait fish. They're looking for anything that's an easy target for them to take. This is a good one for that.
Well, you talked about stripping the line in with a wiggle like that. Well, let's jump right into the presentation video that you've provided for us too, and walk us through some of the different ways you may want to present some of those flies.
Yeah, again, presentation varies for me And a lot of it's going to be trial and error. In this video, you're going to see some fish coming to the surface. Those are white bass that are coming up and eating minnows in a school. And a lot of times they're going to come up and just crash through that school and get as many minnows as they can, and you'll see them come to the surface. So the fly that I'm using here, I'm fishing it just under the water's surface, and I'm just making small little strips, and then I'm pausing the fly on every second or third strip to just add that bit of pause will sometimes trigger a white bass, trigger a smallmouth bass, and that's why I do that. And you can see that I've got another intern. Her name's Lucy, and she usually helps me catch fish too. She's always at my side. Another thing about fly fishing, not a lot of people think you can do it from a boat, but especially this is probably June of last year. We're casting really lightweight flies into shore, and you can see we're fishing cattails. For some reason, those fish were just keying in on those cattails, and we were finding big schools of 50 to 100 fish. And you can see there, I didn't really need to do much with it before they came up and ate that fly. But on that day, it seemed like you needed to do really long, slow strips, and then just let that fly sit there. Long, slow strip, let it sit, and then usually those fish would come up and eat it when it was just kind of sitting, wafting in the water. And yeah, and that's a normal size white bass, I think, for pier, probably 14 inches or 15 inches or so. This particular occasion, I'm fishing in the moving water, so the current. I'm fishing down by the Bad River, and the current is taking my fly. I'm fishing with a heavy Clouser minnow, and I'm just kind of letting it drift as I strip it in, emulating a bait fish pattern. And those fish were hanging out in the current, and they were keying in on those bait fish, and that really worked well that day. So it really just depends on the type of water you're fishing. It depends on the day you're fishing. Sunny days with no wind, you might have to switch to a smaller presentation, something a little bit less intimidating, I guess, to a fish. I found that to work better. And on cloudy, darker days, you might want to fish something a little bit larger. Dark patterns seem to work better on darker days. This is going back to the day in the boat where the sun was out prominently there, but you can see I'm really not stripping it a lot. I'm just pulling it slowly and then letting it sit, pulling it slowly, and I didn't feel that strike, but I saw the fish come up and eat the fly. That's the only reason I knew I had a fish on. That's one of the coolest things to me about fishing the Missouri River is the water's so beautiful and clear. In Pier it is anyway. Some places it's not, but in Pier you can sit on the boat, you can cast that fly out, and you can watch these fish come up and eat them, and it's quite an entertaining thing for me. And I didn't keep any of these fish in the videos that I had sent, but I will typically keep some fish, and when we want to have a fish fry for lunch or something like that. My kids love white bass. I love to eat them, and I'm looking forward to that this spring. 2020 is going to be a really good year for them.
Let's take a look again at that Game Fish and Parks website page on the white bass, because there's a lot of information there, not only identification, but with each of these you'll find how many you can keep, what size, any sort of restrictions too, if you're not do something else besides catch and release.
Yeah, and that's an important point, Larry, that currently the possession limit for white bass is unlimited. And that gives you an idea of just how prominent they are in South Dakota waters. But those rules and regulations are certainly subject to change. Our fish biologists, Game Fish and Parks fish biologists do an awesome job of monitoring the species and setting those rules and regulations and advising the board to set those rules and regulations in such a way that we're helping the species advance and move forward, making them prominent for South Dakota anglers. But white bass are prolific feeders, they're prolific breeders, and they are very prominent in South Dakota. So you can go out and catch as many as you want, and keep a few for the frying pan and maybe let the rest go. If you're not all about eating fish, the tug is certainly a great time. Get some kids out there, and kids have a blast. One thing that you might have noticed in the pictures, the one specifically with Grayson, early on we were introducing the interns. Grayson had a fly tied onto his Scooby-Doo fishing pole. This was back when he was 3 years old. This was last year. So you don't even need a fly rod to fly fish. I started fly fishing with a spinning rod, a clear bobber, and a fly 4 feet down, fishing for trout. And Grayson's doing the same. We tie a fly onto his Scooby-Doo rod. We put a little bobber up 3 feet or so, and I let him cast it. I let him reel it in. Usually his erratic retrieve is helps trigger those bites with those white bass. And he just loves it. Every time we catch one, he'll say, "Oh, can we do that again? Can we do that again?" And it's a pretty special thing for me, especially if we can keep some and say, we're going to keep a couple to eat, but it's important that we keep this resource going. We don't want to keep too many. We don't want to waste any fish. And just it's a good learning lesson for a little kid like that.
Well, and you've had the chance to go out and help people learn about how they can enjoy fishing and create their own fish stories, but you're also involved in a project where people can go and check in on other fish stories.
Fishstories.org is my pet project. It's an online archive for fishing stories, and it's not related to GF&P stuff, but during this time when COVID is kind of causing some kerfluffle and we are stuck inside, it's a really great opportunity to meet anglers without actually physically seeing them in person. You can learn about people's lives. You can hear some really great fishing stories. And also you can record your own on your smartphone and put them into the archive. And with us being cooped up inside, why not preserve some of our favorite memories as anglers, preserve some of our legacies, or preserve a conversation with an angler we care about. We're just stuck inside with them all the time, and keep them around forever. That's kind of why the archive's there. So yeah, I'd encourage people to check out fishstories.org right now, and also encourage them to check out gfp.sd.gov for fishing rules and regulations. Once you do go out and catch some fish, you can tell your favorite fishing stories and keep them around for a long time.
Well, and I hope the message has gotten through as we take a last look at some of the pictures that you shared with us, not to be intimidated about trying a fly rod and having some fun with it.
When people see me out on the water, they might think I'm, my kids call me a hobo, but I'm not afraid to wear what I am comfortable with. You'll usually find me in swimming trunks or sweatpants with holes in them, sandals, old tennis shoes. One thing that really prevented me from getting into the fly fishing world when I was young was this idea that you have to look the part. You have to have the nice waders. You have to have all the great tools. Really, all I carry with me I carry this pack, little fishing pack on my hip, and I carry my fly rod, and this is it. So if you have those two things, something to carry some gear in, heck, it can be in your pocket if you want it to, and a fly rod, you can fish anywhere in South Dakota. You can fish for trout, northern, walleye, carp, catfish, and of course white bass, and any other fish that swims in South Dakota. And don't be intimidated about how you look, because when you're catching fish, people aren't going to care about that. They're just going to say, "Oh, hey, I've got an old fly rod sitting back at my house. Maybe I should get that out and give it a try." Say, "Yeah, that's a good idea." And when you do, here are some flies you could try, and here's how you tie on a leader. You can begin that education process, and people will really appreciate you for it.
Buddy, thank you for sharing your expertise, not only through game fish and parks, and we hope you have the opportunity to get back in classrooms and extend that engagement, but thanks for being our guest here today and sharing some of that information, encouraging everyone to get out and enjoy the waters and maybe catch a white bass along the way. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Larry, for what you guys are doing, and thank you for having me on here today. It's been a real honor.
Take care.